Good evening, my fellow Americans. First, I should like to express my gratitude to the radio and television networks for the opportunities they have given me over the years to bring reports and messages to our nation. My special thanks go to them for the opportunity of addressing you this evening. 3 days from now, after half a century in the service of our country, I shall lay down the responsibilities of office as, in traditional and solemn ceremony, the authority of the presidency is vested in my successor. This evening, I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. Like every other citizen, I wish the new president and all who will labor with him Godspeed. I pray that the coming years will be blessed with peace and prosperity for all. Our people expect their president and the Congress to find essential agreement on issues of great moment, the wise resolution of which will better shape the future of the nation. My own relations with the Congress, which began on a remote and tenuous basis when long ago a member of the Senate appointed me to West Point, have since ranged to the intimate during the war and immediate post-war period, and finally to the mutually interdependent during these past 8 years. In this final relationship, the Congress and the administration have, on most vital issues, cooperated well to serve the nation good rather than mere partisanship, and so have assured that the business of the nation should go forward. So my official relationship with the Congress ends in a feeling, on my part, of gratitude that we have been able to do so much together. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. Despite these holocausts, America is today the strongest, the most influential, and most productive nation in the world. Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. Throughout America's adventure in free government, our basic purposes have been to keep the peace, to foster progress in human achievement, and to enhance liberty, dignity, and integrity among peoples and among nations. To strive for less would be unworthy of a free and religious people. Any failure traceable to arrogance or our lack of comprehension or readiness to sacrifice would inflict upon us grievous hurt, both at home and abroad. Progress toward these noble goals is persistently threatened by the conflict now engulfing the world. It commands our whole attention, absorbs our very beings. We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, atheistic in character, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. Unhappily, the danger it poses promises to be of indefinite duration. To meet it successfully, there is call for not so much the emotional and transitory sacrifices of crisis, but rather those which enable us to carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint, the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle with liberty, the stake. Only thus shall we remain, despite every provocation, on our charted course toward permanent peace and human betterment. Crises there will continue to be. In meeting them, whether foreign or domestic, great or small, there is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy. Balance between the cost and hoped for advantages. Balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable. Balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual. Balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. Good judgment seeks balance in progress. Lack of it eventually finds imbalance and frustration. The record of many decades stands as proof that our people and their government have, in the main, understood these truths and have responded to them well in the face of threat and stress. But threats, new in kind or degree, constantly arise. Of these I mention two only. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea. Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of disarmament, of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road. So in this, my last good night to you as your president, I thank you for the many opportunities you have given me for public service in war and in peace. I trust in that service, you find some things worthy. As for the rest of it, I know you will find ways to improve performance in the future. You and I, my fellow citizens, need to be strong in our faith that all nations under God will reach the goal of peace with justice. May we be ever unswerving in devotion to principle, confident but humble with power, diligent in pursuit of the nation's great goals. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing aspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings. those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
That was Dwight D. Eisenhower, farewell address after 2 terms, 8 years as president. Did you hear the middle part? The middle part, he talks about the military, peacetime military being. This is a former general. He was the commander of all Allied forces, telling Americans to be mindful of the fact that there's this very large, substantial peacetime military, but it's not just in the sense that there's soldiers and generals, but there's the weapons that they are using, the stuff that is manufactured for them to use as to destroy things, made by different companies, right? Companies that get contracts from the government, and there's a vested interest all across the country, millions of people, right? So do you know that one of California's during the Iraq War, one of California's senators, Dianne Feinstein, was a part of the Senate committee that voted on defense contracts, and was actually voted to award certain contracts to certain companies that she knew her husband was a major shareholder. And then he talks about the environment. He talks about using resources, right? Complex. Those are the words he used. But let's look at this time period. So this is January of 1960. He gave this statement 3 days before he leaves the White House, and that house is going to be lived in for a little while by a guy named John F. Kennedy, right? But let's look at this Eisenhower guy as president. He's a Republican, right? Eisenhower is a Republican. He's the first Republican in the White House since Herbert Hoover left office in early March 1933. A 20-year period. That's 20 years of Democrats being in charge, right? Only 2. Franklin Roosevelt, who ran for office 4 times, ran for president, right? Which was never done before, and it hasn't been done since because they passed a constitutional amendment saying you couldn't do it, right? But Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 saw war in Europe, war in the Pacific possibly looming, so wanted to stay on for that and ran for an unprecedented 3rd term. So you have FDR and Truman, and these two, both Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, are going to fundamentally revolutionize government and American society. Things that we take for granted today, right? Really expand exponentially the powers of government, how it affects our lives, our relation, Social Security, the money that comes out of your paycheck, right? All those little where's that $72 going? Damn it! FDIC. What's FDIC? Money, insuring your money, the money you put in the bank. Didn't happen before Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, right? The idea of healthcare, of a sort of a public universal healthcare system, which isn't going to happen, but all sorts of stuff. Eisenhower is not going to be. He's from the opposition party, right? He's from the other party, which, in our own lifetime, If one party, I mean, you've seen this with what was the thing that was there a healthcare thing that our current president is a Democrat or Republican?
Democrat, or yeah.
No.
Or
the current one.
Oh,
his name is Donald Trump.
Oh, he's a Republican.
He is a Republican. His predecessor, Barack Obama, was a Democrat.
Yeah.
He did some health. Wasn't there something he did?
Obamacare,
the Affordable Care Act. And what was Donald Trump going to do when he got in office?
Take it off.
He wasn't not just take it. He was going to repeal every word of it. Right? Eisenhower does not come into office with this alternative. The Republican Party, the opposition party, is not really it's not really ideologically the way it is today, where it's like, okay, the Democrats came in and did these big government programs. We're opposed to big government programs, so we're going to try and dismantle as much of this as we possibly can. And we're pledging that to the voters, and that's how we're going to win an election, right? This government off your back, I'm going to come in and tear stuff down, right? Eisenhower doesn't do that. Eisenhower is what you would call not the term people use, not a transformational. He doesn't transform. He's a transitional president, right? He's from the other party. He comes in, but he does not reverse anything really that FDR or Truman did. All these government expanded exponentially, right? You think about the New Deal, government grew a lot. Then there's a world war, global conflict, government grows even more, right? So there's the world that people have in 1950, 1955 is completely different from what was there in 1930. Right? As far as just the amount of resources, the amount of government agencies, the amount of power government has, and how it affects our daily lives, yada yada, So he's actually going to, he's not going to roll back on he's not going to get rid of Social Security. He's not going to try to, go after any sort of safety nets. He's actually going to continue with big government program, with this idea of government spending and using the federal government to fight the Cold War, not just militarily, but through various projects. Let's skip down to the bottom here. Okay, well, this chapter, the chapter on the 1950s, there's the Cold War chapter, which goes into the early 50s, and then there's this chapter on, the 1950s, right? Who knows the 1950s? Who's seen an episode of Leave It to Beaver? It was just like that, or the Andy Griffith Show. It was just like that, the whole time. The whole time. I'm just kidding. It's called an affluent society, right? It's an affluent society because at the end of World War II, which ends the Great Depression, right? The spending on the war, mobilizing people, now all of a sudden there's work for people. There's people in the service. When people come home from World War II, there's a GI Bill which gives them money to go to school, to get houses, to buy a house, to job training stuff, right? And also, there's a Cold War. There's this posturing with the Soviet Union, so military spending is going to remain substantial. So there's lots of employment there, right? And also the winners and losers of World War II are all completely devastated, right? So this is the golden age of manufacturing, or in America in the 1950s. Did you see those pictures of Japan, of Tokyo and those cities? They're completely destroyed. So it's not going to be until like the 1970s, 1980s that there's really any stiff competition as far as producing consumer goods, right? America is going to be at the top. As a result, the gross national product it's going to more than double. It increases from 1946 to 1960, 2.5 times. The average income goes up 60% from 1950 to 1960. So this is from 1950 to 1960. By the end of this decade, income has gone up 60%. I don't know. Think about what you were making in 2010, and 2020 is really close. Are you making 60% more than you were in 2010? I'm not. I might be making less. But you know what I'm saying? That's a lot. I mean, you think of like the minimum wage, the argument over minimum wage. The minimum wage, federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. It hasn't really budged, right? So you can imagine at the end of a 10-year period, the average person is making 60% more, right? And this is the generation that lives through the Depression and through World War II, is known as the greatest generation. Why? Because they lived through a Depression and a World War. They're pretty great, right? That's pretty substantial. No, you're like they ain't shit. The generation after that, their children are called the baby boomers, right? Who's heard of the term baby boomer? They're called baby boomer because there's a massive amount of children born in the generation following World War II. People come home and are, hey, we didn't die in Europe or in Japan. Let's get married and hey, the government's giving us money to go to college and buy a house. This is great. We don't have to worry. There's no depression. We're not in bread lines. You know what I'm saying? No. So in 1946, there are a record number of marriages, 2.3 million marriages in 1946. But there are also a record number of divorces. A lot of people, people cite the baby boom thing. They cite the record number of marriages. A lot of times they don't look at at the time, this was the largest number of divorces in 1 year in the United States. In 1946. Why? Because a lot of people, December 7th, 1941, there's Pearl Harbor, there's a draft. A lot of people, February, March 1942, when they joined the military, hey, let's get married, right? At 17 or 18 or 19 years old, they marry somebody that they'd been maybe dating for a month, or somebody they didn't know, because they weren't sure if they were going to die, you know? And they're like, well, I need to get married now. I'm 18 years old. I could go over to, the Guadalcanal and never come back. So I might as well get married now. And a lot of those folks came home, and then they realized they weren't necessarily compatible, or they came home with post-traumatic stress, right? They say, they would say like, oh, we didn't talk about, they used to say about World War II, we didn't talk about it back then. It wasn't not like the Vietnam era, right? The people who are Vietnam veterans, the idea that there are protests and there's all these problems that veterans bring home. But the World War II generation, they just didn't talk about it. Well, yeah, they just self-medicated with alcohol, and there was spousal abuse, and because there's people not everybody, but there's very traumatic events in people's lives, right? And they cope with it in a certain way. And so there was a record number of divorces. You can imagine, you're 18 years old and you marry somebody, they're gone for a few years, they come home and they have nightmares about, being in combat or something like that. It's very, and there's no, there's veteran stuff, there's a GI Bill, but as far as like the concept of post-traumatic stress or medication or to deal with that in a certain way, they didn't have that like we do now. So, but yeah, so marriage. The gross national product is going to go up. There's this GI Bill, so that veterans are using it to go to school, buy houses. Houses like the idea of suburban homes, of tract homes, right? Like you see these places now. You drive past them, and these like multi-unit places that all spring up, and tract homes. Levittown is the name, is really the first substantial one in America, right? They didn't have those before the late 40s, early 50s. Neighborhoods are sort of built up organically, but now suburban neighborhoods, right? Suburban neighborhoods that people are going to move into. Remember those pictures we saw of the Gilded Age and stuff? These European immigrants who lived in tenements, packed into the cities. Unsanitary, right? Now, remember Triangle? Remember that? Remember those living conditions and the work conditions? This is their grandchildren, basically, right? Who are going to be living in these, getting money from the government when they come home from fighting to go buy houses in these neighborhoods, right? These suburban neighborhoods. They have a television in every home, right? And they're going to need a television, and they're able to live in these homes, right, that are more spread out away from the city because they're able to commute to work. How are they able to commute to work? The Federal Interstate Highway Act, right? The interstate highway system. This is a project that's going to begin under Dwight Eisenhower. It is probably the largest public works project in the history of the world, right? The interstate highway system. Who was on an interstate? Who was on a highway? Who took the freeway to get here? 280, 680. Is 101, the Interstate 80, right? All the interstate. It's kind of self-explanatory. It's freeways that cut across state lines, and it's all right. There's a Carl's Jr. every 32 miles, a green burrito Carl's Jr. AM PM, right? It was honestly when they was first built, it was a big deal. I came across a whole bunch of postcards. Like they used to have these postcards, but they'd have ads and stuff on. There were roadside motels, like the Roadrunner Motel. It's on a postcard, like it's a big deal. It's like this, but if you look at a lot of these places, these like sort of Route 66. These sort of. Has anyone ever driven cross country? You see these motels, and they look kind of beat up and old. Like 50 years ago in the early 60s, these were like nice, these were new, and it was this thing to do. You drive, you get on the road and you drive, right? Everyone has a car. Everyone, commutes to work, live in these houses. they have television. So now they're not living in the cities. They have television. Now this is where night games come from, right? The concept of professional sports being played at night is for television. It's entirely for television. It's the only reason it exists, right? People go to work all day. They drive home, and this is why you have baseball in California, right? There used to be cities that could support 3 baseball teams. New York had 3 baseball teams, right? Does anyone know which ones? It has 2 still, but the Giants were in Manhattan. Dodgers played in Brooklyn. Yankees played in the Bronx, right? Boston had 2 teams, the Braves and the Red Sox. But once people move out of the cities, right, they're not going to the game, and they're not going to as many games. The attendance dips. And then also you have the interstate highway system. You have planes now, right? You can traverse the continent. It's not, they used to have to hop on a train and go from game to game, you know? So in the same way that railroads revolutionized American life in the mid-19th century, the interstate highway system, flight, right, air travel is going to do so in the mid-20th century. So, and now we're nostalgic about railroads. People are always like, oh, Amtrak does that one route. I want to take the train. You know, we're nostalgic about trains now. But if it was back in 1850, trains were like the new thing, and you thought they were destroying American life. They were, making life difficult for Native Americans. They were killing all these buffalo. But now we're nostalgic about trains. And now, like, if you really juxtapose the triangle, like that imagery we saw in that triangle documentary, these newly arrived European immigrants from Italy and Russia and places like that, and the sweatshop conditions they worked in, really tight, packed into the cities, and compare it to everyone having sort of a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom, a house with a couple kids and the TV and the car, right? That ethnic identity really disappears because of this, which is good and bad, I guess. Like these communities, you have Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants, right? They live in their own little section of the city. They have their own newspaper, stuff like that. People move out to the suburbs, and it dilutes that sort of tight knit, feeling, right? It's sort of in a way it assimilates a lot of your people who are maybe the children or the grandchildren of European immigrants, right? From early 1900s. Yeah. And unlike, I would say, poverty is still going to be in the mid-1960s when there's a war on poverty declared at the time. Poverty is around 24%, which is still substantial, but significantly less than what it was in the Gilded Age or in the 20s. In the 20s, it was as high as 40%. Right? In the Gilded Age, that whole idea of the Gilded Age where wealth was being created, right? There was wealth, but it wasn't necessarily making it to everybody that was involved in this wealth, all of the workers and whatnot, In this situation, it's a little different, right? You have 18 million men who served in the armed forces during World War II. Over 8 million of them are going to use this GI Bill thing when they come home to go to college, to get houses, right? It's very substantial. But a lot of these neighborhoods, like Levittown and these different, there's still housing discrimination, right? Certain groups are discriminated against from living in certain neighborhoods, so that has an adverse effect, right? You could be a veteran of a certain ethnicity and you get money to go buy a home, but certain neighborhoods just aren't going to sell you a house. There's still issues with that sort of thing today, So there's definitions up there. Soft power. Soft power is basically, right, the ability to shape the preferences of others through appeal and attraction. Lead by example. Rather than to coerce people or to bribe people or to use force against people, to convince them that your way is better just by demonstrating it, That's an element. So there's the Cold War. It sounds, people think of Cold War, well, they hate each other. The Soviet Union and the United States, they don't like each other, but they're not really fighting each other. There's a military element to it, right, that takes root in, the United States commits itself to combating the spread of communism, which leads to assassination attempts on Fidel Castro, getting involved in Vietnam, other things. But there's also another element to it where you're competing It's your way of life against this other superpower's way of life, right? They have a certain way their society is run, and the United States is a certain way our society is run, and how we think of ourselves. And so the way we live, just the way we live, right? The luxuries we have, people seeing this sort of stuff. Seeing the idea of a lot of women who went to work during World War II in industrial jobs, having a lot. Part of the argument behind them, many of them returning home and becoming homemakers, right? Like sort of, even if they wanted to continue working, was the appeal of in America, only one spouse has to work. You can support a family. The jobs we have, this was in the 50s. Now that world, that doesn't really exist anymore. I don't think. Some people, but anyways. So this idea of look at all of the look at the way of life, the quality of life in America, right? That's a means with which you fight the Cold War. Look at all these public works projects we have. Look at how efficient our society runs. Look at all the freedom. Look at I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy. They don't have I Love Lucy on Soviet television. Have you ever seen state-run television? Well, actually, Sesame Street's state-run. That was KQED, but still. Yeah, that's soft power, right? A good example would be of this. I think would be. Does anybody recall? There was that. She was 14 years old at the time in Afghanistan, and the girl who was shot in the face by the Taliban.
Oh yeah, she survived.
Because she wanted to go to school, right? This girl, she survives. And now she won a Nobel Peace Prize. She's this advocate for education for girls in Afghanistan. She never fired a shot. She never shot at anyone, a member of the Taliban. Never shot at any member of Al Qaeda, and yet her existence. The example she sets is probably just as substantial as an army march. As we sent an army to Afghanistan, right? But this person's what she represents is really an important, influential thing, and it's not. It's just by just by the way she lives. She's not using force. She's not coercing people. That's soft power. A good example would be like you think of the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. It's not just like a military buildup, like these two countries building up their weapons systems to compete against each other. It's that people in the Soviet Union, people behind the Berlin Wall, they want like a Metallica. But there's also hard power, a coercive approach to international political relations, especially one that involves the use of military power, right? Like the invasion of Iraq. You're going to be a democracy now because you kick down the door, dismantle the entire government, dismantle the entire military. It's for their good. You're giving them a system that in our eyes is better, but it's completely by force, right? This is going to happen in Iran in 1953. Do you know that the thing that is important to remember about American foreign policy too, in general, but definitely in the Cold War. The Cold War is seen as communism versus what? Democracy? Santa Claus? Chimichangas. Democracy, right? What? Ooh. It's like usually people say democracy, freedom, democracy. Which is not entirely true. It's capitalism versus communism. It's two different. If the United States is going to align itself in order to prevent communism from spreading into Europe or into East Asia, is going to align itself with certain governments, certain places. If they're a democratic government, that's cool. But if they're not a democratic government and they still want to be our allies, we're cool with that too. Stability, right? Stability is the most important thing. Loyalty and stability, right? And so occasionally there are situations where the United States ends up supporting folks, and you see this today, that aren't very democratic, that don't really reflect our values as far as representative government, equality. Has anyone ever Saudi Arabia? You guys familiar with Saudi Arabia? The United States has a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia. They have some pretty gnarly human rights issues and treatment of women and stuff like that. Iran is actually going to overthrow a dictator and have elections and elect a president in the 50s. But the problem with this is the president wants to what's called nationalize Iran's oil fields. right? You have British Petroleum, you have American and European oil companies that are going under the ground in Iran and pumping all this stuff out called oil, right? And he says, well, it's in Iran, we should have control over it, nationalize it. And nationalizing it means like almost like state run, so it's kind of socialistic. The Central Intelligence Agency is actually going to orchestrate a coup, mastermind the overthrow of this president and bring back this dictator. There was going to be the president wanted to carry out agrarian reform, land reform, right? Where there's this wealthy American corporation that controls a lot of land, but basically just saying, well, you don't get to control it anymore. I mean, you're from America. This is Guatemala. We want to have our land back, and I want to give it to the people, or stuff like that. That poses a threat to American business.